Morning. How are we doing? Man, it is really good to be in a room full of people, huh? Safely distanced and masked, of course. And good morning to all of you on Tri Church Online. It's good to be with you guys. I want to start this morning with a question. Have you ever thought about the difference between having a visitor come to your house versus having a guest arrive at your house? I could hear some of you laughing. You're ahead of me. If you've never thought about the difference, my guess is that you have probably felt it. Okay, think about it. You're at home in an evening watching TV or doing whatever it is that you do at home at night, and suddenly knock on the door. Now, if this person is a visitor, you were not expecting that knock. And panic sets in, right? If you're like me, right? You like knocking. Me and my wife, we kind of look at each other like, who is it? I don't know who it is. You know who it is? I don't know who it is. We'll get the door. I don't want to get the door. You get the door. Well, I'm not wearing real pants. You get the door. I don't want to get the door. Do they know we're here? Turn off the lights. Kids, to the basement, right? Like, I'm millennial. I can't help it. Maybe your family's not quite as dramatic as ours, and you guys actually open the door, but either way, the reality that your home and yourself were not prepared for this person to arrive makes that person a visitor. That is what a visitor is. Now, a guest is something different entirely. They knock, and it's not unexpected. You've been waiting for this moment. You have prepared for this person's arrival. This is a guest. My wife, she has this really amazing ability. It's a supernatural, spiritual gift of hers to make our home feel like a home for anybody that comes by. It's really a cool thing. And so anytime we have guests, and we love having guests over at our house, we love it. And that's not one of those pastory things that I'm supposed to just say. Really, we like having people at our house. And it's great to watch her kind of spring into action and just go into hospitality mode. The house gets clean, floor to ceiling. I eat good that night. Okay, which is awesome. It's great to kind of watch all those things happen. We leave the front door wide open so that when people arrive, they know, hey, you are welcome to just come right on in. We're ready for you. We have a screen door. I wasn't raised in a barn, but we keep it open, and it's awesome. And there is definitely a different approach that we take when engaging with a person, depending on whether they are a visitor or they're a guest, right? If we didn't know that, we had felt it for sure. But this morning, I want to challenge us to consider this from the other perspective. We all know that feeling, what it's like receiving a guest versus a visitor. But what happens when it's you? What happens when you are the guest or the visitor? What happens when you arrive somewhere prepared for or unprepared for, announced or unannounced? And what does all this have to do with our relationship with God, the 23rd Psalm, and finding true and lasting, real satisfaction in our lives? That's what we're going to tackle this morning. Over the past 4 weeks, we have been in this series called Satisfied. It's actually how we here at Westside started this year, 2021, off. We've been on this deep dive into the 23rd Psalm, seeking guidance as to how to, especially in light of the year we just had, find real, lasting satisfaction, peace, and calm in our lives, especially in our relationship with Jesus. And I don't know about you, church, but man, this series has just hit me different. I didn't realize how much I needed this until we were in it. And it's every week after service, I'm just man, I really needed that. So hey, if you are new to Westside, or if you are tuning in for the first time, or this is your first week, or maybe for any host of reasons you had to miss the last couple of weeks, I would strongly recommend you hopping online, website, our YouTube channel, and getting caught up and checking out these other messages. Nobody asked me to say that, okay? That is just genuine recommendation from me to you, okay? It's been fantastic. So here's a question. So in the midst of an environment and in a culture that feels like anything but peace and calm, this psalm has been leading us toward a deeper understanding of how God offers true and unshakable satisfaction. One where our external circumstances don't have to influence our internal peace quite so dramatically. Doesn't that sound nice? Isn't that kind of like this dream and hope that we have to be able to live a kind of life where all of our external circumstances don't have to impact our internal peace quite so dramatically? That's what we've been searching for. And so to recap very quickly, in our first week, Eddie, he introduced us to this series and to this idea that kind of satisfaction in our lives, it does not have to be elusive, and it can be found when and only when we begin to listen to our good shepherd, not all the other influences and distractions in this world. And then we learned about rest and quiet and the importance that these play in our lives and how they aid us in our ability to hear from our shepherd, from Jesus. We learned about righteousness, or what is right. And how the path that we're on always will determine our destination. Eddie himself said that this is kind of an obvious thing, but so often we live our lives like it isn't. So what does it mean to be on the right path and to do the right thing and to follow the good shepherd down that right path? And then last week, Jeremiah, he led us through the valley of the shadow of death. We came out the other side. We did it. But it was amazing, and it was incredibly encouraging, this idea that even though we may even though we may find ourselves in places of difficulty and shadow and darkness, we're never alone. This morning, I get the privilege of concluding our journey through the psalm by looking at verses 5 and 6. If you haven't noticed yet, this psalm is it is a deep well. It is a rich vein of depth and profoundness, every word having significance. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to kind of walk intentionally and slowly through don't worry, you'll get to lunch on time. I won't do that. But we're going to take our time through these words to make sure we don't miss a single thing that God might be trying to tell us this morning, because it is just so full of truth. And so to do that, we're going to start, like I said, in Psalm 23, verse 5. But only a part of it. We're not going to read the whole thing. We're not even going to read half of it. We're just going to look at this kind of initial beginning part. And in that, David, he says this: "You prepare a feast for me." Now, at first reading, this can seem like one of those ideas or sentiments or even pictures that paints this pleasant image of God being a good God. And that's kind of all it is. And it's kind of that, but there, like so many other things in this psalm, there's so much more to it. Really dig in to what's taking place here, because keep in mind, this is this very same passage, the same psalm that just mere words ago was talking about going through valleys of shadow and darkness and death and all of these different types of things. And now David is talking about this feast, and he paints this picture of a table. Now, David, who is the author of these words, and it is the same David, King David, Goliath, father of Solomon, that guy. He's an artist. I mean, clearly, right? He was a poet, and he had this amazing ability to use art to help paint pictures around things that are harder to comprehend about God. Because if you notice how big God is and how mysterious God can be, and there are all these aspects of God that are kind of beyond our comprehension. And so art is one of these really cool things that can be used, take things that we are familiar with, images we are used to compare and help us understand better some of these deeper mysteries of God. And that's kind of what David's doing here. He's using his words to help us understand this phenomenon of valleys of darkness, but yet suddenly this table. And it's also here where we find ourselves that the importance of the difference between a guest and a visitor really comes into full focus. Because see, David doesn't just say that God has this great feast that we just happen to stumble upon, that we are intruding upon him, or that we have to somehow earn and do enough, fix enough of ourselves to earn a spot at this table. No, what David is saying, I mean, look at the words that he uses. He says that he prepares for us. The fact that God prepares for us means that we are not visitors to God's table. We're guests. We're guests. We don't knock at God's door and God panics and is like, "Who is that? Turn out the lights." That's not how it works. And as comical of an image as that is, we hear that and we're like, of course God doesn't work that way. But how many of us live our lives like he does? Maybe we knock, or maybe we even go so far as to not knocking at God's door, wondering if we've done enough, whether if we're worth enough, whether if we're at a place where he would even consider opening the door. And guys, I'm telling you, this just is not how God works. God has been expecting you. You are not a visitor. Your arrival was not unexpected. God has been preparing for you, waiting for your arrival. Just as you are right here, right now. Not some perfected version of yourself that you feel like you've got to get to before you can actually take your place at God's side. No, God is saying like that. He looks down on you and says, this version of you right here, right now, I have prepared a place for. Like not even just broad picture all of Christians. I mean, that's true, but it's even more focused than that. It's more personal. It's like there is a name card with your specific name placed right at the table that God is sitting at, and he is expecting you and ready for you, inviting you to join him. And guys, God has put out a spread, okay? Unlike anything you've ever seen. How many of us have experienced that kind of thing though, right? Like that kind of prepared forness, being a guest. One of my favorite Christmas traditions that we have as a family, every year on Christmas morning, we wake up and kind of have Christmas just, the 5 Clevelands, my wife and I and our kids. Yes, we have 3 kids. It's loud. But it's good too. It's good. But we have some time together, and then we literally load up into the van and over the hill and through the woods to Mimi and Paul's house we go. And it's great. But one of the reasons it's such a wonderful tradition is that the moment we arrive, we are just surrounded by evidence that we have been prepared for. I mean, the street that they live on is known throughout their whole community as like the place to go to for Christmas lights, right? I mean, it's just down the whole lane. So you pull onto the road and it's just like, bam, you're met with all of this stuff. And then you kind of come onto the drive, and usually Paul, he's standing out in the driveway waving you in, and the kids take off running out of the van into the house, and there's food out in the kitchen. The rooms are prepared for, beds are ready, activities planned, or space to rest is created. That's kind of my jam. It's great. It's great. It is this amazing feeling of value and safety and rest and warmth. I mean, really, guys, it's love. But what's crazy here is that David is not talking about family. He's not talking about friends. He's not talking about humans trying to meet the needs of other humans. David is talking about the literal God of the universe. The very same God that spoke words and galaxies spun into existence, the very same God that spoke words and ripped Jesus right out of the ground and defeated sin and death, that same God is the God that is preparing and waiting for you and for your arrival, who has made a place at his table. Can you imagine that kind of feeling? Can you imagine that kind of worth that you would feel knowing that the God of all creation looked down upon you, not a perfected you, but a real you, and invited you to his table anyway? He invites you to be satisfied, which is an extension of what David was talking about back in verse 1 whenever he says, the Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need. This is it. This is what David's talking about. Now, church, if that's where the verse ended, honestly, it'd be a pretty good verse. Right? I'd be pretty happy with that. But it doesn't. David goes on because David is trying to paint a reality of what it's like to follow God, not just the sugar-coated version. And in this next part of the verse, man, it gets weird. Okay, it takes a weird switch. Look at this. Continuing into verse 5, it says, "You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies." What is that? Like, really, take just a hot second to think about, picture in your mind that reality. If I'm being honest with you guys, I can't help but just laugh a little bit. Like, I'm picturing this table with warmth and light and candles and food just pouring everywhere, and laughter and merriment to us and God, and just kind of this whole like Shire feeling, right? And then, I'm a bit of a dork, sorry. But then, like, you look around and it's like the bad guys are just standing in a big circle around you. Like, you're surrounded by enemies. Like, that's awkward. Like, what are you supposed to do with that? Like, what are they just like, Like standing there watching? Like what do I wave? Like what is supposed to be my approach? Do I offer them a turkey leg in truce? Like what's protocol here? Because this is a very strange situation. It makes me feel like kind of some of those feelings we used to have like in junior high or something, where you're kind of going into the cafeteria, with your tray, and you kind of sit down and it's like, I've got my lunch, I've got what I need, but like you can't help but just kind of have that awkward feeling of being surrounded by unknown and, enemies and all that kind of weird junior high drama and all that stuff. It's weird. But there's this far more significant reality that's taking place in here beyond just what it seems. Because here's the question. I wonder how many of you had kind of developed this thought that I had early on in my faith journey, that growing closer to God, developing spiritual disciplines and enhancing my relationship with Him should lead to the elimination of my enemies and difficulty and trials, right? And if they haven't, then I'm just not close enough to God yet. Well, church, if any of you are walking that journey, feel free to take the next exit, because that's just not how God works. That's not how God works. God doesn't say He's going to eliminate those things. God says He's going to walk with you in them. In fact, because He's God and can only do what God does, He takes it a step further and doesn't just promise to walk with you through them. Because God has this amazing sense of humor, He plants this table right down in the middle of it. Right in the middle, and He fills it with everything you need and says, hey, come sit. Don't worry about all that stuff. Sit. It's amazing, right? I want to read something for you that I came across as I was preparing for this message. I was reading a bunch of different things, and I came across this commentary that just really struck me. It's by a fairly renowned theologian named Charles Spurgeon. And years ago, he wrote this about the 23rd Psalm, and it just stuck with me, and I want to share it with you. It says this. He's talking about verse 5. When a soldier is in the presence of his enemies, if he eats at all, he snatches a hasty meal, and away he hastens to the fight. Okay? Now think about that for a second. When we consider being in the presence of our enemies, we usually, you can't help but kind of think about it in a combative soldier type way. And what he's saying is, in that reality, if a soldier gets to eat at all, which sometimes they don't get what they need, they get a small meal, which is definitely not the entirety of what they need. And then they have to get up, and off into danger they go. But this is not what David is talking about. Look, he says, observe, thou preparest a table, just as a servant does when they unfold the damask cloth and display the ornaments of the feast on an ordinary, peaceful occasion, right? He's talking about some cultural practices hosts used to do for guests as they prepared for an ordinary, peaceful occasion. Nothing is hurried. There's no confusion, no disturbance. The enemy is at the door, and yet God prepares a table. And the Christian sits down and eats, listen to this, as if everything were in perfect peace. Perfect peace. Church, if Jesus is your shepherd, Scripture promises you will either be reconciled to your enemies or you will be vindicated in truth in His perfect timing. Sometimes we got to wait a little longer for that than we would care for, but that's how it is. God's timing is always perfect. These are promises that Scripture offers us. However, God does not promise to eliminate enemies, trials, valleys of shadow. Instead, He plants a table full of everything we need and more right in the middle of it all, so that we may experience His goodness and safety, His love, even in the midst of our enemies. When we look around and wonder how so many people or certain people can seem so calm and at ease while the rest of the world seems like it's on fire, I can't help but think that they know something about sitting at the table of God that the rest of us are still trying to figure out. And even though it is the right path, talking about righteousness, to forgive and love our enemies, it is not our role or responsibility to give them a place at that table. That's God's job. It's His table. It's not our right. Our job is to simply accept the invitation given to us. And this church is a fuller and more accurate depiction of what it means to have true peace and satisfaction in our lives through Jesus. It is not the elimination of difficulty and enemies or trials. It is knowing with full confidence that you sit at the table of God even in the midst of it. We lack nothing. In fact, this is what David goes on to say, it's like, not only does God like take these steps and invite us to this table in the midst of our trial, but like it doesn't stop there. He says, you prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. Look at this. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessing. God not only welcomes and prepares a place for those who follow him, but he goes even further because he is such a good God and loves you just so profoundly much that he rewards and blesses those who follow him as well. To a degree that is so lavish and bountiful that it can't possibly be contained. David says that as God welcomes us to his table, he anoints our heads with oil, which admittedly may seem like a strange act to us in the modern era. It's not a common hospitality practice to invite guests to our home and then put oil on their face or their hair. But it used to be. It used to be a very common practice back in David's time, even well into Jesus' time. It was a sign of respect and blessing and honor. Because y'all, it was dirty and dusty during those times. I mean, walking from town to town, covered in all this stuff. Oh, and hot. Mention it was hot, like you'd be sweating all this stuff. Like I'm pretty sure God built me like half Canadian. Like I am just not meant for the heat. So gross, right? And think about it. They're going from town to town, sand and dirt and animal droppings, all this stuff, usually in sandals or sometimes barefoot. So a very common hospitality practice would be that a host, as they prepared for guests, would provide two things. One, a means for their feet to be washed, usually by a servant. Jesus gets a hold of that one and kind of turns it on its head later. That's a whole nother sermon. We'll save that for later. And also to anoint their heads with oil or perfume or something that could be used to put in their head because, again, they smelled, right? David, he takes this known, familiar imagery for the people of his time for them to be able to quickly understand what to expect by being welcomed to God's table. Now, it's not as familiar to us, so we got to dig into it. But here's the truth. What you can expect at the seat, taking your seat at God's table, is perfect hospitality. Perfect hospitality. Lacking in nothing. Everything that you would expect and more. And God is not just a good host. My wife's a good host. God is the host. He is the Lord of hosts. And so we are not only prepared for, not only are we given a seat at God's table in the midst of trouble, in the presence of enemies, but God honors his children by pouring out a level of blessing that can't be contained. I mean, that's, again, David using his art and to kind of create this imagery around a cup that just can't hold everything that God is trying to put into it. And in response to all of this, David concludes this psalm, not just verse 5, but from the very beginning, 3-4 weeks ago, however long it's been, he takes all of that and he concludes it in this way with verse 6. He says, surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life. See, because David had experienced the goodness and peace of God's presence, especially in the midst of trial and hardship. That's really where those things shine. He says that he shall, listen to this, he will spend the rest of his life in faithful expectation of God's goodness. Because David has tasted of God and has had that kind of intimacy with God, he will wait in faithful expectation of God's goodness every day, the rest of his life, regardless of circumstances. That is an invitation that is available to each and every one of us if we would trust and put our hope in God. Because ultimately, that's what's at the heart of it. His faith and trust in God, a result of experiencing God's mercy and grace, has built into David this very calm and very confident response. No matter what, God, I will trust you. Whether I am on a mountain or in a valley, whether it is a green pasture or the shadow of darkness, God, I will trust you. Because, church, if there's one thing that this last year taught us, is there's a lot of stuff in our life that we have no control over. Right? And the more we try to hold on to the things that we have no control over, the more frustrated, the more stressed, the more unsatisfied our lives become. And David, all these thousands of years ago, look, he gives us this solution, this answer. He says, no matter what, regardless of my external circumstances, God, I will trust you. Because it does not matter what is going on around me. There is this table in the middle of it. that you invite me to, that you are in control of, because you are the God of the universe, and you prepare for me and put upon that table every single thing I could possibly need, things that can never be taken away from me, no matter what happens. It's amazing. I will trust you in the presence of my enemies, in the shadow of death. God, I will trust you as a sheep trusts a shepherd. And it's because of that trust that David finds true satisfaction. But it would be so easy to be able to gloss over this verse and miss this word pursue. Like we would do ourselves a disservice if we didn't take at least a little bit of time to look at this word pursue. Because for so many of us, I've heard it so many times, people feeling like God is near to us, God is far from us. I don't know, this kind of thing, almost as if God is doing this back and forth with us, moving away and coming closer. Guys, the truth is, God is only ever moving in one direction, directly to you. Always pursuing you. It makes me think of the parable Jesus told of the 99 sheep that the shepherd left behind to go after the one. God is only ever moving towards you, never away. It's us that moves away. It's us that goes near and pulls far. God is only ever pursuing. And so my question for you this morning is this: are you ready to let the pursuit stop? Are you ready in a place where you're ready to accept what it is that God has for you? Are you ready to give up the seemingly endless chase of trying to find or create satisfaction in your life, from drawing water from shallow wells, seeking life where there is none? I mean, remember what the angels told the Marys at the tomb. Why do you seek for the living amongst the dead? How many of you are tired of looking for life in places of death, where there is no life, where there is nothing to be offered, where there is no peace and calm and satisfaction? Are you ready for another way? Because there is an invitation available to you. Are you ready, even in the presence of your enemies, to take a seat at God's table and simply bask in his glory and goodness, regardless of your external circumstances? There is no better time than today to accept this invitation, friends, to find God's perfect grace and peace and satisfaction, and to come to a conclusion like David did, because look at his last few words. This whole psalm, all of the profound depth that we have explored through this is how David chooses to end all these words. He says, "And I will live in the house of the Lord forever." So it's like mountains, valleys, trials, table, like it doesn't matter. This is the promise. This is what I know I have. Eternity, me and God forever, true peace, a place, not even just at God's table, but a spot in his house that he invites me to and gives to me because he loves me, because he sees me, and because he knows me. This is the invitation that's available to any of us, whether or not we're ready to accept it. So I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know how you started the year 2021. I don't know if you're already in that place where it's like, okay, it kind of just feels like, 2020, the sequel. And you're ready for something new. You're ready to just say, okay, I acknowledge that there are things about everything going on that I can't control, but what is it that I can? And you realize that the thing that God has been leading you to is to let go of all of that other stuff and just to focus on him, just to set your mind and your eyes and your heart upon him, to take the seat at his table that he has been offering for you, that he's pursuing you to take and to claim.